Hello, my name is Sean Briscoe, and in this presentation I will introduce you to the idea of arguments or argumentation as they pertain to academic competitive debates. If you'd like a more in-depth examination of argumentation, I actually recommend that you check out the book Winning Debates by Stephen Johnson. Specifically, Chapter 2 of that book goes into a lot more detail about the information that's going to come up in this presentation. First of all, I'd like to start off with the idea of what is an argument, because I think a lot of people don't really understand what an argumentation is, especially when you look in context of contemporary media. But for example, some people might say, as they start to argue with a teacher or something like that, they might say that teachers assign too much homework. And the question is that actually an argument? Well, no, it's not an argument. It's a claim. It's a statement of opinion. There's no support to it. There's no real relevance to it. In order to make it an argument, you have to provide some sort of support behind it. And the reality is that everyone who engages in debate, every single person in our society has worked in arguments our entire life. We don't just, it might be that we just don't necessarily bring it to the forefront of our consciousness. You know what's persuasive to you if you really think about it. People have to provide some sort of support, and they have to keep digging deeper until they find something that makes sense to you, that you agree with. And once they've done that, then they can persuade you of their idea. If you look at this initial question of teachers assign too much homework, or the initial idea, in order to truly make it an argument, you've got to give it some sort of teeth. And like I said before, part of that is just finding support to back up your initial claim, but then also providing an impact or relevance to that support as well. So what is an argument? I think the first thing we need to look at is what they are not. They're not a statement of belief, it's not a question, it's not an assertion, and it's absolutely not a knockdown, drag-out fight. Okay, a lot of times when I talk to beginning debaters or I'm watching novice debaters in competition, they just start asking a lot of questions. Well, how much is that going to cost? Well, who's going to do this? Well, how do you know that's going to work? Well, what about this? What about that? None of that is an argument. It's simply a question. Okay, you have to do more than just ask questions. You have to do more than just make claims. Arguments are actually logically connected ideas that prove a point. You have to keep stepping from one point to the next, to the next, to the next, until you build a complete idea. And I've already talked about this, but arguments actually have two parts. They have the claim and they have the warrant. The claim is the initial idea that you want to prove, the thing that you want your audience to agree with. And the warrant is the support that you provide to back up your claim. There are actually 5 ways that you can go about constructing arguments. There are simple arguments, convergent arguments, chain arguments, compound arguments, and complex arguments. To be completely honest, I don't think that it's necessary that you know what these 5 types of arguments are. The 5 types of arguments, I illustrate them here simply to help you think about how you construct your ideas in a persuasive way, or how you go about creating arguments in debate rounds. I would never expect my students to actually be able to tell me, well, that's a convergent argument, or develop a compound argument. The idea here is that you understand what goes into an argument so that you can develop your ideas in a debate round or in a conversation that you're having with someone later on. So let's break it down. A basic argument, or a simple argument, has a claim, the idea you want to prove, and then the support behind it, or the warrant. So we could have a simple argument such as seatbelts save lives. In order to prove that claim, we would need to have some sort of evidence, some sort of support behind it. And we could use different research studies, different statistics talking about people who have worn seatbelts in accidents and those who haven't, or using crash test dummies and those sorts of things. Those types of warrants and those types of supports would back up your claim that seatbelts save lives. You can also have a cluster argument, in which instead of just having a single claim with a single piece of support, you have several independent types of support behind your claim. So in this particular example, you can see that we have our initial claim, and then there are 3 separate types of supports. Now the nice thing about developing an argument in this way is that if your opponents beat one of your aspects of support, you still have two other types of support behind your idea, in which case you've still proven your argument. If you are trying to persuade someone outside of an academic debate, if they don't agree with two of those supports, they don't find them persuasive, well, maybe they would find the third one to be persuasive. So again, we could look at seatbelt studies, we could talk about how seatbelts save lives, and we could look at three separate types of support, or three different ways in which seatbelts save lives, looking at head-on collision studies, side impact studies, and rollover studies. Using those three separate types of supports, we would show or demonstrate that seatbelts do in fact actually save lives. But a lot of times that initial support that you provide isn't enough to convince your audience. Sometimes you have to keep digging deeper. Maybe they didn't find that particular piece of support to be compelling. Maybe they didn't agree with the author. Maybe they don't find that to be a credible author. Or maybe it just brought up another question in their mind. And so you have to keep digging deeper. And that's where chain arguments come in. You provide your initial claim, and you support it. You provide a warrant behind it. But maybe that additional support becomes an additional claim that your audience just doesn't necessarily believe. And so you dig deeper and you provide support behind that idea. So again, we could go back to the initial idea that maybe teachers assign too much homework or that homework is bad. We could make an argument, or a claim, excuse me, that homework is pointless. We could support that with an explanation or an example of that most of the homework that teachers assign is actually busy work, that it's not actually engaging students, it's not forcing them to think critically, or it's not encouraging them to think critically, it's just busy work. You look something up in the text and you write it down on a piece of paper, or you write something multiple times. But someone else might look at that and say, well, that busy work is still teaching you something. The fact that you have to look up that idea somewhere in the text and write it down gets you digging into the material. The fact that you're writing things multiple times develops some sort of muscle memory in your hand if it's a spelling word or something like that. There's various different things that people could say, hey, I don't think that's actually busy work. So you dig a little bit deeper and you bring in examples and statistics and show the types of homework that teachers are assigning in your schools. And maybe you have to even dig deeper than that and show why that's busy work. And so there would be a fourth level to this chain argument. Okay, so you would keep digging deeper until you find something that is persuasive to your audience. We could have a complex argument, which simply brings together all of these ideas. Okay, we've got our initial claim with three separate independent supports, and then one of those supports has three other independent supports. And we keep making the argument bigger, larger, more complete, until we tell a compelling story that convinces our audience of our position. Or in a debate round, you're providing multiple types of support in hopes of beating your opponents. So, let's look at a full example of this complex argument using the initial claim that homework should be banned. We could have three separate independent arguments, or three independent supports behind that idea. We could talk about how homework has limited educational value. We could have an argument related to the idea that that assigning all of this homework decreases citizenship. And then we could have a third support that talks about how homework disproportionately harms lower income students. Okay, so we have three separate supports. And again, remember, when we're looking at that initial claim of homework should be banned, these are three separate independent ideas. So if our opponents were to beat one or even two of those, we still might be able to win the debate through the third idea. Okay, but when we look at these three separate supports, it's unlikely that many of the people you're trying to convince that any of those three supports are actually true, particularly in a debate round, or if you're talking to a teacher. Let's say you're talking to your teacher and you're saying you should ban homework, or you should no longer assign homework, and you're talking to your principal and you're saying that homework should be banned. If you just say homework has limited educational value, it decreases citizenship, and it disproportionately harms lower income students, more than likely they're going to look at you and go, right. So you've got to dig a little bit deeper. You've got to develop these ideas more. So we could start with this idea that homework has limited educational value, and we could develop it a little bit more, and we could talk about two independent supports. Again, each one of these supports are independent. You only need one of them to prove the idea that homework is of limited educational value. So on the one hand, you could talk about homework is mostly busy work, and that's what I showed in a previous slide, and you would provide the statistics behind that. But then you could also have a separate line of argument dealing with the idea that the brain, the human brain, needs rest time in order to absorb the material. And you would then further support that with studies that would show that as you're inundated with all types of information, as you're bombarded with all types of information in school, the only way that your brain is going to be able to make sense of it is if you have some downtime. And so part of that chain of support is going to need to develop the idea that you simply are not having time to rest, that you're going to class for 7 hours a day or 8 hours a day or 6 hours a day, and then each of your teachers is assigning 30, 45, 60 minutes of homework. And so you never have a chance to let that material actually soak in, for you to really internalize it, to understand it. And so therefore, homework has limited educational value. Now, there's a second argument, or a second line of argument in this complex argument, and that's that homework decreases citizenship. Well, that idea in and of itself probably isn't going to be very convincing. I think you have to do a little bit more, and so we have a compound argument here, which again is combining some different types of arguments as well. On the one hand, we're going to need to develop the idea that high school, or school in general, is about more than just academics. That school was developed school was created to develop good citizens, right? And so there's a lot more to school than simply understanding how something works or learning your math, whatever. It's about making a productive member, or developing a productive member of our society who's informed about issues, who is a conscientious voter, who looks out for other individuals, who can apply things, etc. And so we can look at this idea and dig a little bit deeper and say that school isn't just about the classes that we take. We also need to participate in extracurricular activities in order to develop some of those ideals of citizenship. The idea of teamwork, of working towards a goal with other individuals, of cooperation, and those types of things. But we need to combine that with something else in order to make this argument meaningful. And that's that teachers are only available for extra instruction directly after school. So if you're needing help with your homework, you have to go and work with that teacher immediately after school, but that's also the same time that extracurricular activities are taking place. And so there's a trade-off then. We're having to miss out on extracurricular activities because of the time that we spend on homework, either because we need assistance from the teachers, or maybe it's even just a time trade-off, that the only way I can make time for that homework is to give up the extracurricular activities, and therefore then we're losing that citizenship development. We're only working on one aspect, one pillar of the school. Okay, so that's argument number 2. And then the third argument is that homework disproportionately harms lower income students. And to develop that idea, we have 2 additional supports as well. We can talk about how lower income students end up falling farther behind because lower income students don't necessarily have the privilege of being able to go home and just work, do their homework. Maybe they're having to go and work a job. And so they're not able to spend that time on the homework. And that means they fall farther and farther behind in school, which means we have lower graduation rates and those types of things. But there's also a second aspect of it, and that's that family income is harmed. That perhaps students need to go and work in order to help provide for the family. And if they're assigned all of this different homework, one of 2 things has to give. They're either giving up the time to work on school, which means they fall further behind, or they're giving up that extra family income support, which means the family suffers. Either way, you're disproportionately then harming lower income students. And so we have 3 separate arguments related to the idea that homework should be banned. That's how you develop a case. That's how you develop arguments in a debate round or as you're trying to persuade someone. Now, that primarily addresses the idea of how you build arguments, how you construct arguments. But of course, in a debate round, you're also going to have an element of deconstruction. You're going to look at your opponent's ideas and you're going to try and tear them down. So this is the idea, or deconstruction is the idea, that you engage your opponent's arguments. You engage their claims and their supports and you try to disprove them. The best way to do that in a debate round is to go after the biggest weaknesses in those arguments. Identify inaccuracies in their statements, in their supports. Find tenuous relationships. A lot of times people are going to bring in ideas that seem like they're related, but maybe they're not necessarily proving their case. Maybe they're only somewhat related. Maybe they're making a leap of logic, and so they're not necessarily actually proving their point. And as a debater then, you reach into that and you identify where the connection is missing. Maybe they're using some flawed assumptions. Maybe there's something that when they're looking at this idea, they're completely coming at it from the wrong direction, and that misunderstanding of the bigger idea is causing them to construct an inaccurate argument or a weak argument or a flawed argument, and so you can then attack that idea. In a nutshell, what you really want to do is think big picture. Find the biggest weakness in your opponent's claims, in your opponent's arguments, and go after that idea. But then finally, in a debate round, you're also going to engage in an element of framing the debate. Okay? And that's how we view the round, how we understand each of the arguments, because both sides of the debate are going to present arguments. They're going to construct arguments, whether they be simple, convergent, complex, whatever. They're going to both sides in the debate are going to develop their own independent arguments. They're also going to attack each other's arguments. They're going to deconstruct those ideas. And at the end of the debate, you also need to frame them. And by framing, I mean you're assigning priority to the different arguments in the debate. Provide context to the things that each team has presented in the debate. Identify the relevance of each of those arguments and help us to understand which argument is most important. That is what happens in a debate. When you're talking about arguments and argumentation, you present a logically connected idea or multiple logically connected ideas to prove the broader claim.